Mikhail Alexandrovich Bakunin was a Russian revolutionary anarchist, and founder of collectivist anarchism. He is considered among the most influential figures of anarchism, and one of the principal founders of the social anarchist tradition. Bakunin's enormous prestige as an activist made him one of the most famous ideologues in Europe, and he gained substantial influence among radicals throughout Russia and Europe. Bakunin grew up in Pryamukhino, a family estate in Tver Governorate, where he moved to study philosophy and began to read the French encyclopédistes, leading to enthusiasm for the philosophy of Fichte. From Fichte, Bakunin went on to immerse himself in the works of Hegel, the most influential thinker among German intellectuals at the time. That led to his embrace of Hegelianism, bedazzled by Hegel's famous maxim, "Everything that exists is rational." In 1840, Bakunin traveled to St. Petersburg and Berlin with the intention of preparing himself for a professorship in philosophy or history at the University of Moscow. In 1842, Bakunin moved from Berlin to Dresden. Eventually he arrived in Paris, where he met Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Karl Marx. Bakunin's increasing radicalism including staunch opposition to imperialism in East and Central Europe by Russia and other powers changed his life, putting an end to hopes of a professorial career. He was eventually deported from France for speaking against Russia's oppression of Poland. In 1849, Bakunin was apprehended in Dresden for his participation in the Czech Rebellion of 1848, and turned over to Russia where he was imprisoned in the Peter Paul fortress in St. Petersburg. He remained there until 1857, when he was exiled to a work camp in Siberia. Escaping to Japan, the US and finally ending up in London for a short time, he worked with Herzen in the journal Kolokol. In 1863, he left to join the insurrection in Poland, but he failed to reach his destination and spent some time in Switzerland and Italy. In 1868, Bakunin joined the Socialist International Working Men's Association, a federation of trade unions and workers' organizations, which had sections in many European countries, as well as in Latin America and in North Africa and the Middle East. The Bakuninist, or anarcho-socialist trend rapidly expanded in influence, and included the largest section of the International, Spain. A showdown loomed with Marx, who was a key figure in the General Council of the International. The 1872 Hague Congress was dominated by a struggle between Marx and his followers, who argued for the use of the state to bring about socialism, and the Bakunin anarchist faction, which argued instead for the replacement of the state by federations of self-governing workplaces and communes. Bakunin could not attend the Congress, as he could not reach the Netherlands. Bakunin's faction present at the conference lost, and Bakunin was expelled for supposedly maintaining a secret organization within the International. However, the anarchists insisted the Congress was unrepresentative and exceeded its powers, and held a rival conference of the International at Saint-Imier in Switzerland in 1872. This repudiated the Hague meeting, including Bakunin's supposed expulsion. The great majority of sections of the International affiliated to the Saint-Imier body, making Marx's victory rather more illusory than pro-Marxist accounts suggest. The far larger Bakuninist International outlasted its small Marxist rival, which was isolated in New York. It also greatly facilitated the global spread of anarcho-socialism. In the International, as well as in his writings, Bakunin articulated the basic ideas of syndicalism and of anarchism, and developed the basic anarchist analysis and strategy. He had by this stage abandoned the anti-imperialist nationalism of his youth. From 1870 to 1876, Bakunin wrote some of his longer works, such as Statism and Anarchy and God and the State. Bakunin remained, however, a direct participant in struggles. In 1870, he was involved in an insurrection in Lyon, France, which foreshadowed the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune closely corresponded to many elements of Bakunin's anarchist program: self-management, mandates delegates, a militia system with elected officers, and decentralization. Anarchists like Immerse copyright reckless, and those in the tradition of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon who had greatly influenced Bakunin were key figures in the Commune. Despite declining health, much a result of his years of imprisonment, Bakunin also sought to take part in a communal insurrection involving anarchists in Bologna, Italy, but was forced to return to Switzerland in disguise, where he settled in Lugano. He remained active in the workers' and peasants' movements of Europe and was also a major influence on movements in Egypt and Latin America. Biography: Early years. In the spring of 1814, Mikhail Alexandrovich Bakunin was born to a noble family of only modest means. The family owned 500 serfs in the village of Pryamukhino, between Tver and Kvshinovo, in Tver Governorate, northwest of Moscow. His father was a career diplomat who, as a young attaché, had lived for years in Florence and Naples. Upon his return to Russia, his father settled down on his paternal estate where at the age of 40, he married an 18-year-old girl from the prominent Muraviov family. His father's commitment to liberal ideas led to his involvement with one of the Decembrist clubs. After Nicholas I became Tsar, however, Bakunin Sr. gave up politics and devoted himself to the care of his estate and the education of his children, 5 girls and 5 boys, the oldest of whom was Mikhail. At the age of 14 Michael left for St. Petersburg, receiving military training at the Artillery University, a rigid, anti-Western military school, where he chafed at the arbitrary discipline and the narrow curriculum, much less encompassing than the home schooling he had experienced before. He was expelled from school in 1834 for poor grades and assigned to barracks on the Polish frontier. He was commissioned a junior officer in the Russian Imperial Guard and sent to Minsk and Gardenias in Lithuania. Though his father wished him to continue in either the military or the civil service, Bakunin abandoned both in 1835, and made his way to Moscow, hoping to study philosophy. Interest in philosophy: in Moscow, Bakunin soon became friends with a group of former university students, and engaged in the systematic study of idealist philosophy, grouped around the poet Nikolai Stankovic, the bold pioneer who opened to Russian thought the vast and fertile continent of German metaphysics. The philosophy of Kant initially was central to their study, but then progressed to Schelling, Fichte, and Hegel. By autumn of 1835, Bakunin had conceived of forming a philosophical circle in his hometown of Pryamukhino. Moreover, by early 1836, Bakunin was back in Moscow, where he published translations of Fichte's Some Lectures Concerning the Scholar's Vocation and the Way to a Blessed Life, which became his favorite book. With Stankovic he also read Goethe, Schiller, and E.T.A. Hoffmann. He became increasingly influenced by Hegel and provided the first Russian translation of his work. During this period he met Slavophil Konstantin Aksakov, Piotr Holodev and the socialists Alexander Herzen and Nikolai Ogarev. In this period he began to develop his pan-Slavic views. After long wrangles with his father, Bakunin went to Berlin in 1840. His stated plan at the time was still to become a university professor, but he soon encountered and joined students of the young Hegelians, and the socialist movement in Berlin. In his 1842 essay The Reaction in Germany, he argued in favor of the revolutionary role of negation, summed up in the phrase "the passion for destruction is a creative passion." After 3 semesters in Berlin, Bakunin went to Dresden where he became friends with Arnold Ruge. Here he also read Lawrence von Stein's Der Sozialismus und Kommunismus des heutigen Frankreich and developed a passion for socialism. He abandoned his interest in an academic career, devoting more and more of his time to promoting revolution. The Russian government, becoming aware of this activity, ordered him to return to Russia. On his refusal his property was confiscated. Instead he went with Georg Herwart to Tsar I Quarterich, Switzerland. Brussels, Prague, Dresden and Paris. During his 6-month stay in Tsar I Quarterich, he became closely associated with German communist Wilhelm Weitling. Until 1848 he remained on friendly terms with the German communists, occasionally calling himself a communist and writing articles on communism in the Schweizerische Republikaner. He moved to Geneva in western Switzerland shortly before Weitling's arrest. His name had appeared frequently in Weitling's correspondence seized by the police. This led to reports being circulated to the imperial police. The Russian ambassador in Bern ordered Bakunin to return to Russia, but instead he went to Brussels, where he met many leading Polish nationalists, such as Joachim Lellouel, co-member with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels at Brussels. Lellouel greatly influenced him, however he clashed with the Polish nationalists over their demand for a historic Poland based on the borders of 1776 as he defended the right of autonomy for the non-Polish peoples in these territories. He also did not support their clericalism and they did not support his calls for the emancipation of the peasantry. In 1844 Bakunin went to Paris, then a center of the European political current. He established contact with Karl Marx and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who greatly impressed him and with whom he formed a personal bond. In December 1844, Emperor Nicholas issued a decree that stripped Bakunin of his privileges as a noble, confiscated his land in Russia, and condemned him to lifelong exile in Siberia. He responded with a long letter to Lara copyright form, denouncing the emperor as a despot and calling for democracy in Russia and Poland. In March 1846 in another letter to the Constitutional he defended Poland, following the repression of Catholics there. Some Polish refugees from Kraków, following the defeat of the uprising there, invited him to speak at the meeting in November 1847 commemorating the Polish November Uprising of 1830. In his speech, Bakunin called for an alliance between the Polish and Russian peoples against the emperor, and looked forward to the definitive collapse of despotism in Russia. As a result, he was expelled from France and went to Brussels. Bakunin's attempt to draw Alexander Herzen and Vissarion Belinsky into conspiratorial action for revolution in Russia fell on deaf ears. In Brussels, Bakunin renewed his contacts with revolutionary Poles and Karl Marx. He spoke at a meeting organized by Lellouel in February 1848 about a great future for the Slavs, whose destiny was to rejuvenate the Western world. Around this time the Russian embassy circulated rumors that Bakunin was a Russian agent who had exceeded his orders. As the revolutionary movement of 1848 broke out, Bakunin was ecstatic, despite disappointment that little was happening in Russia. Bakunin obtained funding from some socialists in the provisional government, Ferdinand Flukin, Louis Blanc, Alexander Augustin and Alexander Martin, for a project for a Slav federation liberating those under the rule of Prussia, Austro-Hungary and Turkey. He left for Germany traveling through Baden to Frankfurt and Karl LN. Bakunin supported the German Democratic Legion led by Herr in an abortive attempt to join Friedrich Hecker's insurrection in Baden. He broke with Marx over the latter's criticism of Herr. Much later in 1871 Bakunin was to write, "I must openly admit that in this controversy Marx and Engels were in the right. With characteristic insolence, they attacked Herr personally when he was not there to defend himself. In a face-to-face confrontation with them, I heatedly defended Herr, and our mutual dislike began then." Bakunin went on to Berlin but was stopped by the police from traveling to Posen, part of Polish territories gained by Prussia in the partitions of Poland, where a nationalist insurrection was taking place. Instead Bakunin went to Leipzig and Breslau and then on to Prague where he participated in the First Pan-Slav Congress. The Congress was followed by an abortive insurrection that Bakunin had sought to promote and intensify but which was violently suppressed. He returned to Breslau, where Marx republished the allegation that Bakunin was an imperial agent, claiming that George Sand had proof. Marx retracted the statement after George Sand came to Bakunin's defense. Bakunin published his appeal to the Slavs in the fall of 1848, in which he proposed that Slav revolutionaries unite with Hungarian, Italian and German revolutionaries to overthrow the three major European autocracies, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Kingdom of Prussia. Bakunin played a leading role in the May Uprising in Dresden in 1849, helping to organize the defense of the barricades against Prussian troops with Richard Wagner and Wilhelm Heine. Bakunin was captured in Chemnitz and held for 13 months before being condemned to death by the government of Saxony. His sentence was commuted to life to allow his extradition to Russia and Austria, both of whom were seeking to prosecute him. In June 1850, he was handed over to the Austrian authorities. 11 months later he received a further death sentence but this too was commuted to life imprisonment. Finally, in May 1851, Bakunin was handed over to the Russian authorities. Richard Wagner wrote in his diary about Bakunin's visit. First of all, however, with the view of adapting himself to the most Philistine culture, he had to submit his huge beard and bushy hair to the tender mercies of the razor and shears. As no barber was available, Rockall had to undertake the task. A small group of friends watched the operation, which had to be executed with a dull razor, causing no little pain, under which none but the victim himself remained passive. We bade farewell to Bakunin with the firm conviction that we should never see him again alive. But in a week he was back once more, as he had realized immediately what a distorted account he had received as to the state of things in Prague, where all he found ready for him was a mere handful of childish students. These admissions made him the butt of Rockall's good-humored chaff, and after this he won the reputation among us of being a mere revolutionary, who was content with theoretical conspiracy. Very similar to his expectations from the Prague students were his presumptions with regard to the Russian people. Imprisonment, confession, and exile, Bakunin was taken to the Peter and Paul fortress. At the beginning of his captivity, Count Orlov, an emissary of the emperor, visited Bakunin and told him that the emperor requested a written confession, hoping that the confession would place Bakunin spiritually as well as physically in the power of the Russian state. Since all his acts were known, he had no secrets to reveal, and so he decided to write to the emperor. "You want my confession? But you must know that a penitent sinner is not obliged to implicate or reveal the misdeeds of others. I have only the honor and the conscience that I have never betrayed anyone who has confided in me, and this is why I will not give you any names." After 3 years in the underground dungeons of the fortress of St. Peter and St. Paul, he spent another 4 years in the castle of Schlüsselburg. It was here that he suffered from scurvy and all his teeth fell out as a result of the diet. He later recounted that he found some relief in mentally reenacting the legend of Prometheus. His continuing imprisonment in these awful conditions led him to entreat his brother to supply him with poison. Following the death of Nicholas I, the new Emperor Alexander II personally struck Bakunin's name off the amnesty list. In February 1857 his mother's pleas to the emperor were finally heeded and he was allowed to go into permanent exile in the western Siberian city of Tomsk. Within a year of arriving in Tomsk, Bakunin married Antonia Kwiatkowska, the daughter of a Polish merchant. He had been teaching her French. In August 1858 Bakunin received a visit from his second cousin, General Count Nikolai Muravyov-Amursky, who had been governor of eastern Siberia for 10 years. Muravyov was a liberal and Bakunin, as his relative, became a particular favorite. In the spring of 1859 Muravyov helped Bakunin with a job for a Mir development agency which enabled him to move with his wife to Irkutsk, the capital of eastern Siberia. This enabled Bakunin to be part of the circle involved in political discussions centered on Muravyov's colonial headquarters. Resenting the treatment of the colony by the St. Petersburg bureaucracy, including its use as a dumping ground for malcontents, a proposal for a United States of Siberia emerged, independent of Russia and federated into a new United States of Siberia and America, following the example of the United States of America. The circle included Muravyov's young chief of staff, Kukla Euro, who Kropotkin related had the complete works of Alexander Herzina Euro, the civil governor Izvolsky, who allowed Bakunin to use his address for correspondence, and Muravyov's deputy and eventual successor, General Alexander Don Duke of Kosakov. When Herzen criticized Muravyov in the Bell, Bakunin wrote vigorously in his patron's defense. Bakunin, tired of his job as a commercial traveler, but thanks to Muravyov's influence, was able to keep his sinecure without having to perform any duties. Muravyov was forced to retire from his post as governor-general, partly because of his liberal views and partly due to fears he might take Siberia towards independence. He was replaced by Kosakov, who perhaps was even more sympathetic to the plight of the Siberian exiles. Kosakov was also related to Bakunin, Bakunin's brother Paul having married his cousin. Taking Bakunin's word, Kosakov issued him with a letter giving him passage on all ships on the Amur River and its tributaries as long as he was back in Irkutsk when the ice came. Escape from exile and return to Europe. On June 5, 1861, Bakunin left Irkutsk under cover of company business, ostensibly employed by a Siberian merchant to make a trip to Nikolaevsk. By July 17 he was on board the Russian warship Strelok bound for Castry. However, in the port of Olga, Bakunin managed to persuade the American captain of the SS Victory to take him on board. Despite bumping into the Russian consul on board, Bakunin was able to sail away under the nose of the Russian Imperial Navy. By August 6 he had reached Hakodate in the northernmost Japanese island of Hokkaido and was soon in Yokohama. In Japan Bakunin met by chance Wilhelm Heine, one of his comrades in arms from Dresden. He also met the German botanist Philipp Franz von Siebold, who had been involved in opening up Japan to Europeans and was a friend of Bakunin's patron Muravyov. Von Siebold's son wrote some 40 years later. In that Yokohama boarding house we encountered an outlaw from the Wild West, Heine, presumably, as well as many other interesting guests. The presence of the Russian revolutionist Mikhail Bakunin, in flight from Siberia, was as far as one could see being winked at by the authorities. He was well endowed with money, and none who came to know him could fail to pay their respects. Bakunin, his ideas still developing, left Japan from Kanagawa on the SS Carrington, as one of 19 passengers including Heine, Reverend P.F. Coe and Joseph Hecko. Hecko was a Japanese-American, who 8 years later played a significant role giving political advice to Kyodo Tokuroshi and Ito Hayarabumi during the revolutionary overthrow of the feudal Tokugawa shogunate. They arrived in San Francisco on October 15. In the period before the transcontinental railroads had been completed, the quickest way to New York was via Panama. Bakunin boarded the Arizaba for Panama, where after waiting for 2 weeks he boarded the Champion for New York. In Boston, Bakunin visited Karl Forster, a partisan of Ludwig Mieroslawski during the 1848 revolution in Paris, and caught up with other 48ers, veterans of the 1848 revolutions in Europe, such as Friedrich Kapp. He then sailed for Liverpool, arriving on December 27. Bakunin immediately went to London to see Herzen. That evening he burst into the drawing room where the family was having supper. "What? Are you sitting down eating oysters? Well, tell me the news. What is happening, and where?" Relocation to Italy and influence in Spain. Having re-entered Western Europe, Bakunin immediately immersed himself in the revolutionary movement. In 1860, while still in Irkutsk, Bakunin and his political associates had been greatly impressed by Giuseppe Garibaldi and his expedition to Sicily, during which he declared himself dictator in the name of Victor Emmanuel II. Following his return to London, he wrote to Garibaldi on January 31, 1862, "If you could have seen as I did the passionate enthusiasm of the whole town of Irkutsk, the capital of eastern Siberia, at the news of your triumphal march across the possession of the mad king of Naples, you would have said as I did that there is no longer space or frontiers." Bakunin asked Garibaldi to participate in a movement encompassing Italians, Hungarians and South Slavs against both Austria and Turkey. Garibaldi was then engaged in preparations for the expedition against Rome. By May, Bakunin's correspondence was focusing on Italian-Slavic unity and the developments in Poland. By June, he had resolved to move to Italy, but was waiting for his wife to join him. When he left for Italy in August, Mazzini wrote to Maurizio Quadrio, one of his key supporters, that Bakunin was a good and dependable person. However, with the news of the failure at Aspromonte, Bakunin paused in Paris, where he was briefly involved with Ludwig Mieroslawski. However, Bakunin rejected Mieroslawski's chauvinism and refusal to grant any concessions to the peasants. Bakunin returned to England in September and focused on Polish affairs. When the Polish insurrection broke out in January 1863, he sailed to Copenhagen, where he hoped to join the Polish Legion. He planned to sail across the Baltic in the SS Ward Jackson to join the insurrection. This attempt failed, and Bakunin met his wife in Stockholm before returning to London. Now he focused again on going to Italy, and his friend Elio Saffi wrote him letters of introduction for Florence, Turin and Milan. Mazzini wrote letters of commendation to Federico Campanella in Genoa and Giuseppe Dolfi in Florence. Bakunin left London in November 1863, travelling by way of Brussels, Paris and Vevey, arriving in Italy on January 11, 1864. It was here that he first began to develop his anarchist ideas. He conceived the plan of forming a secret organization of revolutionaries to carry on propaganda work and prepare for direct action. He recruited Italians, Frenchmen, Scandinavians, and Slavs into the International Brotherhood, also called the Alliance of Revolutionary Socialists. By July 1866 Bakunin was informing Herzen and Ogarev about the fruits of his work over the previous 2 years. His secret society then had members in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, England, France, Spain, and Italy, as well as Polish and Russian members. In his Catechism of a Revolutionary of 1866, he opposed religion and the state, advocating the absolute rejection of every authority including that which sacrifices freedom for the convenience of the state. Giuseppe Fanelli met Bakunin at Tver in 1866. In October 1868 Bakunin sponsored Fanelli to travel to Barcelona to share his libertarian visions and recruit revolutionists to the International Workingmen's Association. Fanelli's trip and the meeting he organized during his travels provided the catalyst for the Spanish exiles, the largest workers' and peasants' movement in modern Spain and the largest anarchist movement in modern Europe. Fanelli's tour took him first to Barcelona, where he met and stayed with Elie Reclus. Reclus and Fanelli were at odds over Reclus's friendships with Spanish Republicans, and Fanelli soon left Barcelona for Madrid. Fanelli stayed in Madrid until the end of January 1869, conducting meetings to introduce Spanish workers, including Anselmo Lorenzo, to the First International. In February 1869 Fanelli left Madrid, journeying home via Barcelona. While in Barcelona again, he met with painter José copyright Luis Pellicer and his nephew, Rafael Farga Pellicer along with others who were to play an important role establishing the International in Barcelona, as well as the Alliance section. During the 1867–1868 period, Bakunin responded to a Permil Miller-Collas's call and became involved in the League of Peace and Freedom, for which he wrote a lengthy essay Federalism, Socialism, and Anti-Theologism. Here he advocated a federalist socialism, drawing on the work of Proudhon. He supported freedom of association and the right of secession for each unit of the federation, but emphasized that this freedom must be joined with socialism for liberty without socialism is privilege, injustice. Socialism without liberty is slavery and brutality. Bakunin played a prominent role in the Geneva Conference, and joined the Central Committee. The founding conference was attended by 6,000 people. As Bakunin rose to speak, the cry passed from mouth to mouth, "Bakunin!" Garibaldi, who was in the chair, stood up, advanced a few steps and embraced him. This solemn meeting of two old and tried warriors of the revolution produced an astonishing impression. Everyone rose and there was a prolonged and enthusiastic clapping of hands. At the Bern Congress of the League he and other socialists found themselves in a minority. They seceded from the League, establishing their own international alliance of socialist democracy which adopted a revolutionary socialist program. The First International and the rise of the anarchist movement. In 1868, Bakunin joined the Geneva section of the First International, in which he remained very active until he was expelled from the International by Karl Marx and his followers at the Hague Congress in 1872. Bakunin was instrumental in establishing branches of the International in Italy and Spain. In 1869, the Social Democratic Alliance was refused entry to the First International, on the grounds that it was an international organization in itself, and only national organizations were permitted membership in the International. The alliance dissolved and the various groups which it comprised joined the International separately. Between 1869 and 1870, Bakunin became involved with a Russian revolutionary Sergei Nechayev in a number of clandestine projects. However, Bakunin broke with Nechayev over what he described as the latter's Jesuit methods, by which all means were justified to achieve revolutionary ends. In 1870 Bakunin led a failed uprising in Lyon on the principles later exemplified by the Paris Commune, calling for a general uprising in response to the collapse of the French government during the Franco-Prussian War, seeking to transform an imperialist conflict into social revolution. In his letters to a Frenchman in the present crisis, he argued for a revolutionary alliance between the working class and the peasantry, advocated a system of militias with elected officers as part of a system of self-governing communes and workplaces, and argued the time was ripe for revolutionary action. We must spread our principles, not with words but with deeds, for this is the most popular, the most potent, and the most irresistible form of propaganda. These ideas corresponded strikingly closely with the program of the Paris Commune of 1871, much of which was developed by followers of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Marxists were almost entirely absent from the Commune. Bakunin was a strong supporter of the Commune, which was brutally suppressed by the French government. He saw the Commune as above all a rebellion against the state, and commended the Communards for rejecting not only the state but also revolutionary dictatorship. In a series of powerful pamphlets, he defended the Commune and the First International against the Italian nationalist Giuseppe Mazzini, thereby winning over many Italian Republicans to the International and the cause of revolutionary socialism. Bakunin's disagreements with Marx, which led to the attempt by the Marx Party to expel him at the Hague Congress, illustrated the growing divergence between the anti-authoritarian sections of the International, which advocated the direct revolutionary action and organization of the workers and peasants in order to abolish the state and capitalism, and the sections allied with Marx, which advocated the conquest of political power by the working class. Bakunin was Marx's unregistered trademark's flamboyant chief opponent, and presciently warned against the emergence of a communist authoritarianism that would take power over working people. Bakunin's maxim, the anti-authoritarian majority, which included most sections of the International, created their own First International at the St. Imier Congress, adopted a revolutionary anarchist program, and repudiated the Hague resolutions, rescinding Bakunin's alleged expulsion. Although Bakunin accepted elements of Marx's unregistered trademark's class analysis and theories regarding capitalism, acknowledging Marx's unregistered trademark's genius, he thought Marx's analysis was one-sided, and that Marx's methods would compromise the social revolution. More importantly, Bakunin criticized authoritarian socialism, and the concept of dictatorship of the proletariat, which he adamantly refused. If you took the most ardent revolutionary, vested him in absolute power, within a year he would be worse than the Tsar himself. Bakunin retired to Lugano in 1873 and died in Bern on July 1, 1876. Thought: Bakunin's political beliefs rejected statist and hierarchical systems of power in every name and shape, from the idea of God downwards, and every form of hierarchical authority, whether emanating from the will of a sovereign or even from a state that allowed universal suffrage. He wrote in Deux l'État: "The liberty of man consists solely in this, that he obeys the laws of nature because he has himself recognized them as such, and not because they have been imposed upon him externally by any foreign will whatsoever, human or divine, collective or individual." Bakunin similarly rejected the notion of any privileged position or class, since the social and economic inequality implied by class systems were incompatible with individual freedom. Whereas liberalism insisted that free markets and constitutional governments enabled individual freedom, Bakunin insisted that both capitalism and the state, in any form, were incompatible with the individual freedom of the working class and peasantry. It is the peculiarity of privilege and of every privileged position to kill the intellect and heart of man. The privileged man, whether he be privileged politically or economically, is a man depraved in intellect and heart. Bakunin's political beliefs were based on several interrelated concepts: liberty, socialism, federalism, anti-theism, and materialism. He also developed a critique of Marxism, predicting that if the Marxists were successful in seizing power, they would create a party dictatorship all the more dangerous because it appears as a sham expression of the people's will. Authority and free thought. Bakunin thought that does it follow that I reject all authority? Far from me such a thought. In the matter of boots, I refer to the authority of the bootmaker. Concerning houses, canals, or railroads, I consult that of the architect or the engineer. For such or such special knowledge I apply to such or such a savant. But I allow neither the bootmaker nor the architect nor savant to impose his authority upon me. I listen to them freely and with all the respect merited by their intelligence, their character, their knowledge, reserving always my incontestable right of criticism and censure. I do not content myself with consulting a single authority in any special branch. I consult several. I compare their opinions, and choose that which seems to me the soundest. But I recognize no infallible authority, even in special questions. Consequently, whatever respect I may have for the honesty and the sincerity of such or such individual, I have no absolute faith in any person. He saw that. Therefore there is no fixed and constant authority, but a continual exchange of mutual, temporary, and, above all, voluntary authority and subordination. This same reason forbids me, then, to recognize a fixed, constant and universal authority, because there is no universal man, no man capable of grasping in all that wealth of detail, without which the application of science to life is impossible, all the sciences, all the branches of social life. Anti-theologism, according to political philosopher Carl Schmitt, in comparison with later anarchists, Proudhon was a moralistic petty bourgeois who continued to subscribe to the authority of the father and the principle of the monogamous family. Bakunin was the first to give the struggle against theology the complete consistency of an absolute naturalism. For him, therefore, there was nothing negative and evil except the theological doctrine of God and sin, which stamps man as a villain in order to provide a pretext for domination and the hunger for power. Bakunin argued in his book God and the State that the idea of God implies the abdication of human reason and justice. It is the most decisive negation of human liberty, and necessarily ends in the enslavement of mankind, in theory and practice. Consequently, Bakunin reversed Voltaire's famous aphorism that if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him, writing instead that if God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. Bakunin was an early proponent of the term political theology in his 1871 text The Political Theology of Masny in the International, to which Schmitt's book was a response. Political theology is a branch of both political philosophy and theology that investigates the ways in which theological concepts or ways of thinking underlie political, social, economic and cultural discourses. Class struggle strategy for social revolution, Bakunin a unregistered trademark S. Methods of realizing his revolutionary program were consistent with his principles. The working class and peasantry were to organize from below, through local structures interlinked on a federalist basis, creating not only the ideas, but also the facts of the future itself. Their movements would prefigure the future, in their ideas and practices, creating the building blocks of the new society. This approach was exemplified by syndicalism, an anarchist strategy championed by Bakunin, according to which trade unions would provide both the means to defend and improve workers' conditions, rights and incomes in the present, and the basis for a social revolution based upon workplace occupations. The syndicalist unions would organize the occupations, as well as provide the radically democratic structures through which workplaces would be self-managed, and the larger economy coordinated. Thus, for Bakunin, the workers' unions would take possession of all the tools of production as well as buildings and capital. Bakunin did not reduce the revolution to syndicalist unions, however, stressing the need to organize working-class neighborhoods, as well as the unemployed. Meanwhile, the peasants were to take the land and throw out those landlords who live by the labor of others. Bakunin did not dismiss the skilled workers, as is sometimes claimed. Indeed, the watchmakers of the Jura region were central to the St. Imier International's creation and operations. However, at a time when unions largely ignored the unskilled, Bakunin placed great emphasis on the need to organize as well amongst the rabble, the great masses of the poor and exploited, the so-called lumpen proletariat, to inaugurate and bring to triumph this social revolution. Collectivist anarchism. Bakunin's socialism was known as collectivist anarchism, where socially, it seeks the confirmation of political equality by economic equality. This is not the removal of natural individual differences, but equality in the social rights of every individual from birth. In particular, equal means of subsistence, support, education, and opportunity for every child, boy or girl, until maturity, and equal resources and facilities in adulthood to create his own well-being by his own labor. collectivist anarchism advocates the abolition of both the state and private ownership of the means of production. It instead envisions the means of production being owned collectively and controlled and managed by the producers themselves. For the collectivization of the means of production, it was originally envisaged that workers will revolt and forcibly collectivize the means of production. Once collectivization takes place, money would be abolished to be replaced with labor notes and workers' salaries would be determined in democratic organizations based on job difficulty and the amount of time they contributed to production. These salaries would be used to purchase goods in a communal market. Critique of Marxism. The dispute between Mikhail Bakunin and Karl Marx highlighted the differences between anarchism and Marxism. Bakunin argued against certain ideas of a number of Marxists that not all revolutions need be violent. He also strongly rejected Marx's concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, a concept that vanguardist socialism including Marxist-Leninism would use to justify one-party rule from above by a party representing the proletariat. Bakunin insisted that revolutions must be led by the people directly while any enlightened elite must only exert influence by remaining invisible, not imposed on anyone, and deprived of all official rights and significance. He held that the state should be immediately abolished because all forms of government eventually led to oppression. Libertarian Marxists argue Marx used the phrase to mean the worker control at the point of production, not a party, would still be a state until society is reorganized according to socialist principles. They, the Marxists, maintain that only a dictatorship their dictatorship, of course can create the will of the people, while our answer to this is, no dictatorship can have any other aim but that of self-perpetuation, and it can beget only slavery and the people tolerating it. Freedom can be created only by freedom, that is, by a universal rebellion on the part of the people and free organization of the toiling masses from the bottom up. While both social anarchists and Marxists share the same final goal, the creation of a free, egalitarian society without social classes and government, they strongly disagree on how to achieve this goal. Anarchists believe that the classless, stateless society should be established by the direct action of the masses, culminating in social revolution, and refuse any intermediate stage such as the dictatorship of the proletariat, on the basis that such a dictatorship will become a self-perpetuating fundament. For Bakunin, the fundamental contradiction is that for the Marxists, anarchism or freedom is the aim, while the state and dictatorship is the means, and so, in order to free the masses, they have first to be enslaved. However, Bakunin also wrote of meeting Marx in 1844 that, as far as learning was concerned, Marx was, and still is, incomparably more advanced than I knew nothing at that time of political economy, I had not yet rid myself of my metaphysical observations. He called me a sentimental idealist and he was right. I called him a vain man, perfidious and crafty, and I also was right. Bakunin found Marx's economic analysis very useful and began the job of translating Das Kapital into Russian. In turn Marx wrote to the rebels in the Dresden insurrection of 1848 that in the Russian refugee Mikhail Bakunin they found a capable and cool-headed leader. Marx wrote to Engels of meeting Bakunin in 1864 after his escape to Siberia saying on the whole he is one of the few people whom I find not to have retrogressed after 16 years, but to have developed further. Bakunin has sometimes been called the first theorist of the new class, meaning that a class of intellectuals and bureaucrats running the state in the name of the people or the proletariat but in reality in their own interests alone. Bakunin argued that the state has always been the patrimony of some privileged class, a priestly class, an aristocratic class, a bourgeois class. And finally, when all the other classes have exhausted themselves, the state then becomes the patrimony of the bureaucratic class and then falls or, if you will, risks to the position of a machine. Federalism. By federalism, Bakunin meant the organization of society from the base to the summit from the circumference to the center according to the principles of free association and federation. Consequently, society would be organized on the basis of the absolute freedom of individuals, of the productive associations, and of the communes, with every individual, every association, every commune, every region, every nation having the absolute right to self-determination, to associate or not to associate, to ally themselves with whomever they wish. Liberty. By liberty, Bakunin did not mean an abstract ideal but a concrete reality based on the equal liberty of others. In a positive sense, liberty consists of the fullest development of all the faculties and powers of every human being, by education, by scientific training, and by material prosperity. Such a conception of liberty is eminently social, because it can only be realized in society, not in isolation. In a negative sense, liberty is the revolt of the individual against all divine, collective, and individual authority. Materialism. Bakunin denied religious concepts of a supernatural sphere, and advocated a materialist explanation of natural phenomena, the manifestations of organic life, chemical properties and reactions, electricity, light, warmth and the natural attraction of physical bodies, constitute in our view so many different but no less closely interdependent variants of that totality of real beings which we call matter. The mission of science is, by observation of the general relations of passing and real facts, to establish the general laws inherent in the development of the phenomena of the physical and social world. However, his materialism was different to that of Marx, in that it stressed the importance of non-economic factors in human affairs, including ideas and cultures. The revolutionary potential of the proletariat versus the lumpenproletariat and the peasantry. Bakunin had a different view as compared to Marx's on the revolutionary potential of the lumpenproletariat and the proletariat. As such, both agreed that the proletariat would play a key role, but for Marx the proletariat was the exclusive, leading revolutionary agent while Bakunin entertained the possibility that the peasants and even the lumpenproletariat could rise to the occasion. Bakunin considers workers' integration in capital as destructive of more primary revolutionary forces. For Bakunin, the revolutionary archetype is found in a peasant milieu and amongst educated unemployed youth, assorted marginals from all classes, brigands, robbers, the impoverished masses, and those on the margins of society who have escaped, been excluded from, or not yet subsumed in the discipline of emerging industrial work. In short, all those whom Marx sought to include in the category of the lumpenproletariat. Influence. Bakunin is remembered as a major figure in the history of anarchism and as an opponent of Marxism, especially of Marx's idea of dictatorship of the proletariat, and for his predictions that Marxist regimes would be one-party dictatorships over the proletariat, not of the proletariat itself. God and a State was translated multiple times by other anarchists, such as Benjamin Tucker, Marie Lecomte, and Emma Goldman, and he continues to be an influence on modern-day anarchists, such as Noam Chomsky. Bakunin biographer Mark Lenya has asserted that Bakunin had a significant influence on later thinkers, ranging from Peter Kropotkin and Enrico Malatesta to the Wobblies and Spanish anarchists in the Civil War to Herbert Marcuse, E. P. Thompson, Neil Postman, and A. S. Neal, down to the anarchists gathered these days under the banner of anti-globalization. In short, Bakunin has had a major influence on labor, peasant and left-wing movements, although this was overshadowed from the 1920s by the rise of Marxist regimes. With the collapse of those regimes and growing awareness of how closely those regimes corresponded to the dictatorships Bakunin predicted Bakunin's ideas have rapidly gained ground amongst activists, in some cases again overshadowing Marxism. Criticism, violence, revolution, and invisible dictatorship. Bakunin has been accused of being a closet authoritarian by Marxists, Leninists, and other authoritarian leftists. In his letter to Albert Richard, he wrote that, "Here is only one power and one dictatorship whose organization is salutary and feasible, it is the collective, invisible dictatorship of those who are allied in the name of our principle." Charles A. Madison claimed that Bakunin rejected political action as a means of abolishing the state and developed the doctrine of revolutionary conspiracy under autocratic leadership disregarding the conflict of this principle with his philosophy of anarchism. Madison contended that it was Bakunin's scheming for control of the First International that brought about his rivalry with Karl Marx and his expulsion from it in 1872. His approval of violence as a weapon against the agents of oppression led to nihilism in Russia and to individual acts of terrorism elsewhere, with the result that anarchism became generally synonymous with assassination and chaos. However, Bakunin's supporters argue that this invisible dictatorship is not a dictatorship in any conventional sense of the word, as Bakunin was careful to point out that its members would not exercise any official political power in the sense of a Leninist vanguard. Their influence would be ideological, and freely accepted. This dictatorship will be all the more salutary and effective for not being dressed up in any official power or extrinsic character. Bakunin was also criticized by Marx and the delegates of the International specifically because his methods of organization were similar to those of Sergei Nechayev, with whom Bakunin was closely associated. While Bakunin rebuked Nechayev upon discovery of his duplicity as well as his immoral politics, he did retain a streak of ruthlessness, as indicated by a June 2, 1870 letter. Lies, cunning, and entanglement are a necessary and marvelous means for demoralizing and destroying the enemy, though certainly not a useful means of obtaining and attracting new friends. Nevertheless, Bakunin began warning friends about Nechayev's behavior, and broke off all relations with Nechayev. Others note, moreover, that Bakunin never sought to take personal control of the International, that his secret organizations were not subject to his autocratic power, and that he condemned terrorism as counter-revolutionary. Robert M. Cutler goes further, pointing out that it is impossible fully to understand either Bakunin's participation in the League of Peace and Freedom or the International Alliance of Socialist Democracy, or his idea of a secret revolutionary organization that is immanent in the people, without seeing that they derive from his interpretation of Hegel's dialectic from the 1840s. The script of Bakunin's dialectic, Cutler argues, gave the alliance the purpose of providing the International with a real revolutionary organization. Marx's advocacy of participation in bourgeois politics, including parliamentary suffrage, would have been proof of his being a compromising negative in the language of the 1842 Reaction in Germany article. It would have been Bakunin's duty, following the script defined by his dialectic, to bring the International Working Men's Association to a recognition of its true role. Bakunin's desire to merge first the League and then the alliance with the International derived from a conviction that the revolutionaries in the International should never cease to be penetrated to every extremity by the spirit of revolution. Just as, in Bakunin's dialectic, the consistent negatives needed the compromises in order to vanquish them and thereby realize the negative's true essence, so Bakunin, in the 1860s, needed the International in order to transform its activity into uncompromising revolution. Anti-Semitism. In some of his pieces, Bakunin showed a certain anti-Semite sentiment, and has been severely criticized for this part of his writing, not least by anarchists. Bakunin used anti-Jewish sentiments that suggested a Jewish system of global exploitation. This whole Jewish world, comprising a single exploiting sect, a kind of blood-sucking people, a kind of organic destructive collective parasite, going beyond not only the frontiers of states, but of political opinion, this world is now, at least for the most part, at the disposal of Marx on the one hand, and of Rothschild on the other. This may seem strange. What can there be in common between socialism and a leading bank? The point is that authoritarian socialism, Marxist communism, demands a strong centralization of the state. And where there is centralization of the state, there must necessarily be a central bank, and where such a bank exists, the parasitic Jewish nation, speculating with the labor of the people, will be found. However, anti-Semitism was not central to Bakunin's work, which stressed proletarian internationalism and a class analysis of society. Significantly, Jews would always play a large and prominent role in the anarchist movement, among them Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, and Volin. Early nationalism. In his pre-anarchist years, Bakunin's politics were essentially a left-wing form of nationalism, specifically, a focus on East Europe and Russian affairs. While Bakunin, at this time, located the national liberation and democratic struggles of the Slavs in a larger European revolutionary process, he did not pay much attention to other regions. This aspect of his thought dates from before he became an anarchist, and his anarchist works consistently envisaged a global social revolution, including both Africa and Asia. Bakunin as anarchist continued to stress the importance of national liberation, but he now insisted that this issue had to be solved as part of the social revolution. The same problem that dogged Marxist revolutionary strategy would also arise in independent struggles led by nationalism, unless the working class and peasantry created an anarchy. I feel myself always the patriot of all oppressed fatherlands. Nationality is a historic, local fact which, like all real and harmless facts, has the right to claim general acceptance. Every people, like every person, is involuntarily that which it is and therefore has a right to be itself. Nationality is not a principle. It is a legitimate fact, just as individuality is. Every nationality, great or small, has the incontestable right to be itself, to live according to its own nature. This right is simply the corollary of the general principle of freedom. Bakunin, quoted by Alfredo M. Bonanno in Anarchism and the National Liberation Struggle, pp. 19-20. When Bakunin visited Japan after his escape from Siberia, he was not really involved in its politics or with the Japanese peasants. This might be taken as evidence of a basic disinterest in Asia, but that would be incorrect. Bakunin stopped over briefly in Japan as part of a hurried flight from 12 years of imprisonment, a marked man racing across the world to his European home. He had neither Japanese contacts nor any facility in the Japanese language. The small number of expatriate newspapers by Europeans published in China and Japan provided no insights into local revolutionary conditions or possibilities. Besides, Bakunin's conversion to anarchism came in 1865, towards the end of his life, and 4 years after his time in Japan. Works of Bakunin. God and the State, ISBN 0-486-22483-X, Bakunin on Anarchism/edited, translated and with an introduction by Sam Yugu. Preface by Paul Avric, New York Knopf, originally published in 1971 as Bakunin on Anarchy. Includes James Guillaume unregistered trademark S. Bakunin a biographical sketch. ISBN 0043210120. Mikhail Bakunin, Selected Writings, ed. A. Laning. New York, Grove Press, 1974. ISBN 0802100201. Statism and Anarchy, Cambridge University Press, 1990. ISBN 0521361826. No Gods No Masters by Daniel Gouet. Copyright Rin. Edinburgh AK Press, 1998. ISBN 1873176643. Anarchism, A Documentary History of Libertarian Ideas, Volume 1, From Anarchy to Anarchism, ed. Robert Graham. Montreal. New Yorker Black Rose Books, 2005. ISBN 1551642514. The Political Philosophy of Bakunin, edited by G. P. Maximoff, including Mikhail Bakunin a biographical sketch by Max Netley, The Basic Bakunin, Writings 1869 1871, ed. Robert M. Cutler. New York, Prometheus Books, 1992. ISBN 0879757450. Mikhail Bakunin, The Philosophical Basis of His Anarchism, by Paul McLaughlin, Mikhail Bakunin A Philosophia Nagaki, by Jake Ugleek. Warsaw, Aliyah, 2007. ISBN 9780361182085. Bakunin's ideas are examined in depth in Lucien van der Walt and Michael Schmidt's Global Study of Anarchism and Syndicalism, Black Flame, The Revolutionary Class Politics of Anarchism and Syndicalism, with Bakunin described as one of the two most important figures in anarchist history. English translations of Bakunin are generally rare when compared to the comprehensive editions in French, Spanish and German. An 8-volume complete works of Bakunin in English is to be published at some point in the future by AK Press. According to Ramsey Cannon, these will likely be published yearly for 8 years in hardcover format. Madeleine Grawit's a unregistered trademark S biography remains to be translated. The standard but hostile English language biography is by E. H. Carr. A new biography, Bakunin, The Creative Passion, by Mark Lanier, was published by St. Martin unregistered trademark S Press August 22, 2006, hardcover, 320 pages, ISBN 0-312-30538-9, see also, List of Russian anarchists, Anarchism in Russia, references, footnotes. Bibliography. Further reading, McLaughlin, Paul. Mikhail Bakunin, The Philosophical Basis of His Anarchism. New York, Algora Publishing, 2002. Lanier, Mark. Bakunin, The Creative Passion, A Biography. New York, Thomas Dunn Books, 2006. Tom Stoppard. The Coast of Utopia. New York, Grove Press, 2002. Daniel Guerin, Anarchism, From Theory to Practice. External links, Bakunin Archive at Anarchist Library, Bakunin Archive at Anarchy Archives, Bakunin Biography at Flag Blackened, Writings of Bakunin at Marxist Internet Archive, Works by Mikhail Bakunin at Project Gutenberg, a biography by James Guillaume, liebcom.org/ Library Mikhail Bakunin Archive, Mikhail Bakunin page at the Anti-Authoritarian Encyclopedia, Bakunin and the Historians, The Coast of Utopia, Bakunin's Idea of Revolution and Revolutionary Organization from Red and Black Revolution 6, Audiobook of God and the State by Mikhail Bakunin, from LibriVox, German Mikhail Bakunin page, Bakunin texts at Anarchy's Order, Mikhail Bakunin, What is Authority? Mikhail Bakunin, Truark and Far Copyright Rancesvets Oevriers du Val de Saint-Imier, Mikhail Alexandrovich Bakunin at Find a Grave.